Got it. We have no but then what is your reason? Choose someone else. Are we ready? Bryan there. Hi, Bryan.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Thank you for waking up so early.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess you're in. Yeah. Just trying to calculate. It's 5:47 in the morning. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's a little bit early, but I've got a cup of tea, so I'm here.
Excellent. Well, just to do a short introduction here, I would like to welcome everybody to the kickoff of the Berlage sessions, which is our semester seminar series, which takes place on Fridays at midday. In each semester, we have a different thematic. This semester's series is entitled The Architect's Manners, and we're exploring the profession through etiquette and manners, the contractual distinction between the builder and the architect, the graphic conventions of working drawings, architects and their relationship to social media, the stylization of imagery, the masculinity embedded in practice, and other ways, quote unquote, mannerism is enacted by architects today. As anybody who will notice who's seen an overview of the series, this semester we have taken to kind of provide a kind of provocation and a continuity. Each lecture title in this series has, let's say, this possessive the architects, and then fill in the blank to basically stimulate a kind of discussion across all the lectures, I hope implicitly nonetheless. It's a pleasure to have Bryan kick off today with the architect's contract. He will examine how the use of contracts and competitions shape the bourgeoisie practice, private practice system of architectural practice in the early United States, and nurtured the architect's conception of their profession as a benevolent, self-sacrificial act. Or in other words, how the contract offered a technical means to simultaneously insert architectural work into market-based competition, while also imagining it to be a nobler, higher order. He'll tell us today the story about how in the early United States, two forms of competition had profound effect on the formation of the architectural profession. First, the design competition, and second, the competitive bid. Both were causes for complaint amongst architects, yet both only increased in use over the 19th century. Sounds pretty familiar to today also, the same complaints. On the one hand, the competitive bid system, which pitted builders and material suppliers against one another, became one of the architect's primary means for asserting control over the site. Design competitions, on the other hand, pitted architects against one another under judgment by people, often architects felt had no right to be judging them. Bryan will conject on why architects increasingly participated in these systems. They often described as detrimental to their profession by focusing on several early 19th century projects in Philadelphia and New York. Bryan Norwood is an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on architecture and building practices in the United States and Atlantic world in the long 19th century. He is working on two book-length projects. The first, which today's lecture will be a bit of a teaser, it will whet our appetite, I hope, is entitled Architectural Calling, Protestantism, Nationalism, and Racecraft in the Formation of a U.S. Profession, which focuses on the Atlantic coast of the United States between the years 1930 and the late 1860s. The second book is a study of architecture's role in shaping the intersection of industrialization and historical consequences in the American South between the period of Reconstruction and the New Deal. Again, I'd like to thank you, Bryan, for your good citizenship in basically working with our time slot here. And I wish you were here, obviously in person, but that is not possible at the moment. So we look forward to welcoming you at another point here live. But thank you, the screen is yours, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Does it sound good?
Perfectly.
Oh, excellent. All right. Well, I came up to my office at the university very early so I could use the incredibly fast internet that we have here. So I hope this all works really smoothly. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and or be here remotely. I'm definitely looking forward to being back in Delft sometime soon. I think I was in this room 3 or 4 years ago at a conference, so it's nice to be there again remotely. So I want to say thank you to everybody for the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll see if this works. Sure. Okay, slides up and clear.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me begin with a brief narratival hook. What you see here are the conditions for an 1846 building contract, in which every instance of the word "the architect" is crossed out. It's a contract written by the New York architect Alexander Jackson Davis using a fill-in-the-blank legal document he developed and used in the 1840s. So in this case, Davis crossed himself out of a contract he had created. The contract from which Davis excised himself was for the construction of a 4-story house that he had designed for a wealthy client named Charles A. Davis, to which he had no relation, in Gramercy Park in New York. So he combined a set of drawings, here's a couple of examples from the archives, with specifications to communicate his design. In writing the specifications that go along with his drawings of the house, Davis used a standard 12-page fill-in-the-blank document to describe all the labor required of, and as you can see, required of excavators, masons, bricklayers, plasterers, carpenters, plumbers, plasterers, painters, etc. So he then used this set of drawings and these specifications to get a set of bids on the project from carpenters and masons, each of which would act as the general contractor for the whole project. From the 7 bids that he got, Davis selected the stonemasons HB and DC Weeks to perform the work. He then drafted an agreement between the client and the Weeks brothers, and then he removed himself as an active agent from that agreement and struck his name or struck the title of architect out of the contract. So it's worth noting all the authority that Davis gave himself in his standard contract, and then think about the kind of authority that he actually gave up by crossing himself back out. So here are the things in this contract that he would have had authority over. The first would be judging construction work in progress as satisfactory or unsatisfactory, providing further explanations of the drawings, having unsatisfactory work undone and removed from the site, charging the contractor for failing to perform, expensing the contractor for work the architect hired out directly because the contractor failed to do the work himself or herself, I guess himself at this point, making changes to drawings and specs as necessary. And then there's several points where he lays out how he would have binding and conclusive say on all the matters. And then adjusting the building delivery schedule, controlling the distribution of payments over the kind of construction process, and in the end, balancing the total bill. So he gave up all those responsibilities by striking himself from the contract. Davis designed a building and then he handed it off to others to handle the construction. In contracting for a house like this, Davis was doing a thing that a number of professional architects did in the early 19th century in the US, even as they were describing this as a very deficient form of practice. In a period of about 10 months, he made $133. So this is from his diary listing out you can kind of see the different sets of drawings he was doing between February and October. So he made $133 from doing these drawings and writing a set of specifications. You can see he sold us a duplicate set of specifications here at the bottom for $3. So relative to inflation, this is about $5,000 today. So you might have noticed in that previous slide that the building contract was for $7,700. So Davis's total bill for the design was 1.7% of the construction cost. This is hardly what architects like him were arguing they should be paid. The Charles Davis house was a case of an architect not doing what professional architects said they should be doing, which was controlling construction administration and billing at 5% of the total construction cost. However, architects not holding to their putative professional ideals that they had set was not uncommon then. We might say it's not uncommon at other periods in time as well. But I begin with this story not to point out Davis's shortcomings in that sense, but rather to get at a very broad question. What is this profession that formulates its role as mediating between money and craft labor, but then pulls back when it gets its hands dirty with either? That is, what creates a profession that wants to be both in and not in the messiness of the world? What is a profession that shapes a position of authority and then puts itself under erasure in the self-authored document outlining that very authority? So the current book project I'm working on gets at answers to these questions by examining the way professional architecture took shape in the middle decades of the 19th century in the US. I'm attending in particular to the ways the formations of market capitalism, racial and religious discourse, and in the end, white Protestant nationalism intersected with professionalizing ambitions. I find these two images from the 1840s and 50s particularly useful in framing the scope and purpose of this argument. So in William Wilson's frontispiece for the American carpenter turned self-declared architect Edward Shaw's 1854 book, The Modern Architect, we see the architect sitting, using his drafting tools to mediate between the builder's labor and the client's desires and money. The clients are kind of back here behind, standing in the shade of a tree in the back. In this image, the architect is figured as an intermediary, a kind of neutral voice of reason, protecting both the client and the builder. But in Thomas Cole's 1841 painting, The Architect's Dream, a painting done at the request of the architect Ithiel Town, who was based in New York and then in New Haven, Connecticut, the architect lounges on top of a column with his books and drawings, gazing back through the deep historical plot guiding his noble profession, while he's holding forward a drawing. In this image, the architect is presented as a civilized figure, one who sits almost outside of history, using the whole of the past in order to act in the present. So between these two postures, the sitting architect who draws and the lounging architect who gazes back, a kind of unresolved identity crisis was formed. The architect as the master of world historical ideas, aesthetics, and morals, and the architect as a neutral mediator, a protector of both parties in market-based exchange. It's the collision of these two that's of particular interest to me. So in trying to describe the nature of their role, 19th century architects in the US often pointed to lawyers as the quintessential example of the kind of professionalism to which they aspired. Excuse me. The lawyer as a disinterested gentleman whose mediatory work pursued the higher ideal of justice, provided a picture of mediation with an elevated goal. But in a nutshell, in the book that I'm working on, what I argue is that if we were really going to understand the vicissitudes of professional architecture under market capitalism, we'd actually need to interpret the profession in light of the Protestant ministry, a profession to which architects were in fact much more proximate. These proximities took shape through the ways architects talked about the importance and necessity of their work, and in particular, how architects framed their work as a moral tool in bending a divine historical arc. Thus, in the collision of the identities of the architect as a keeper of history and the architect as a mediator, we actually see a piece of the formation of a kind of American civil religion, one in which confidence in the market is confidence in civil society as such. So there's a particular tension in the vision of the profession that took shape in the early 19th century. And this is over the kind of relationship of the ideational design pursued through this kind of relationship with history and the material realization of that design. For architects, this looked like a kind of unintegrated mixture of absolute faith in their power and a kind of resolute disappointment in the limits that they constantly ran up against. To crib from Manfredo Tafori, we could say that early Republican architects often saw themselves as angels with dirty hands. They were practitioners looking towards heaven, but whose work was often sullied by the kind of shortcomings of the material world. So I focus on the time period between the 1830s and 1860s for several reasons. In some of the historical literature, this period is referred to as a moment of stagnation. This moment often gets characterized as a kind of doldrums between the genius of Benjamin Henry Latrobe and the post-Civil War wave of professionalization and large-scale urban construction. It's a moment but caught between these two shifts in architecture, when what people would call Grecian mania was like racking half of the architects, and the rest of the architects were caught in these kind of stultifying stylistic debates over what the right style was for particular things. And indeed, like in a larger scale, this is a moment that's caught between the kind of devastating financial depression of the mid 1830s and one that would come in the late 1850s and would quickly be followed by a civil war. But what I argue is that this moment of stagnation is in fact the sedimentation of a way of practice. It's a moment when architects all along the eastern seaboard of the US were not only developing the contractual design, they were also getting up in front of audiences, like countless other professionals and dilettantes, and lecturing on the moral and political value of their practice. So for example, A.J. Davis, the New York architect with whom I began, told an audience in New York in 1841 that good architecture was absolutely necessary for national progress and moral and religious progress as well. But he said it was being prevented from emerging in the city because Americans kept confusing mere builders for true architects. In fact, he told them, quoting the English architect John Soane, that it was ignorant, unskillful, and lazy builders who were motivated only by money that kept ruining the artistic work of architects like him. In a sense, this language is unsurprising. It mimics the racialized kind of class divisions of market capitalism. Architects started resorting to the professional title of architect when it became useful to distinguish themselves from builders, who they figured as of a lower class. The title of architect became a tool of class distinction. But what it also reveals is a particular kind of conception of the architect's agency and purpose. So the aim of the book I'm working on is to describe the image of architectural practice that took shape in this period of the 1830s to 60s. The arc of the manuscript winds its way through conceptions of design, the use of contracts and competitions, public lectures on architecture, and grand historical visions that shaped narratives about race and religious eschatology. One of my main arguments is, as I have already mentioned, that the nature of architecture was shaped by the tension between two approaches to the design. One that saw architectural work as ideational, as something that connected the earth to heavenly impulses, and one that saw it as a work of earthly mediation. In the ideational sense, the design scope was that of history itself. But in the contractual sense, the design was a mediatory force, not something reaching to the heavens, but rather mediating between money and matter and metabolic activity. What I want to focus on today is how specifically the building contract operated. In particular, I want to describe how architects position the contract as a device for controlling the market-based activity of building in the rapidly developing environment of market capitalism, an environment which architects wanted to both participate in and yet also keep a distance from. That is, I'm interested in how the contract, or what I will call here the contractual design, was a tool for architects to try to be in, but not of the world. So what I'll talk about now is part of a chapter that dives into the character of this contractual design through thinking about two types of competition, the competitive bid and the design competition. So in this chapter, I'm interested in the relationship between these two forms of competition, one that takes place on the terms of the market and the other supposedly in the field of ideas, and how these kind of two forms of competition took off as tools of bourgeois private practice architecture. So in the sense, like you see a competitive bid here on, I think it's on your right, quick submissions of often very short documents, just a few sentences in the early 19th century of how much someone would bid for either a whole job or for the kind of piecework rate of doing a job, and then design competition drawings on the other side. So in one sense, we could argue that the competitive bid and the design competition were both symptoms of a market society, a society enabled by the market revolution of the early 1800s. So cribbing Tafuri again, we could describe the design competition as a formation of an even more capricious bracketed market, a space of exchange where the terms were even less clear than those of the competitive bid. So I'm not going to talk directly on those forms of competition today, but rather I'll spend my time on the contract itself, a key tool that the architect used in managing the market relations on which the competitive bid process depended. The contract allowed the architect, who would claim to have authority in design because of their ideational capacity, which they often would demonstrate through winning a competition, to manage market relations that determined builders' chance to build. So I'm going to focus on contracts and specification documents from the 1830s to 60s produced by architects in two Atlantic coast cities, New York and Philadelphia. New York and Philly in this era were two of the largest US cities. Philadelphia, established in the 17th century and long serving as center for colonial and early Republican culture and government, was a thriving urban environment in the 1830s. New York, which was growing at an incredibly rapid rate since the beginning of the century, became a hub for building and architectural activity over the 19th century. I'll use the contracts of two architects as anchors here: the Philadelphian Thomas Eustace Walter and the New York architect Alexander Jackson Davis, who I already discussed. So they were colleagues and friends from the 1830s through the end of their lives, and they both had enormously successful practices. So with their architectural contracts and a handful of others that I'll construct the argument going forward here. So let's turn to the contract. When I describe the contractual design or the contract, I actually mean a collection of documents. So an 1858 specification document for a courthouse in Lawrence, Massachusetts lays this out really clearly. It says, quote, "The plan specification with the articles of agreement shall constitute the contract." So as with many other specs, this opening salvo went on to say that each of these three documents were to be understood as in harmony with one another, and each was equally binding. So in the case of Davis's standard contract that he was using in the 1840s and 50s, this triumvirate was an assembly of, first, a 12-page specification document, which began with a list of a dozen plus drawings and then went through details of how to construct, and then the drawings themselves, and finally this kind of several-page agreement that set the conditions of work. That is, what I mean by the contractual design is a conception of the architectural design as specifications, multiple drawings, and a signed agreement that put those drawings and specifications into force. The contractual design was the design itself conceived as a contract. Standardized printed building specifications were being used as early as 1831 in the US. In the case of the standard document Walter used in Philadelphia in the 1830s, the agreement was printed, and then the detailed specification, which were handwritten, were referred to as the schedule. In a number of cases like this one, which is a contract for the delivery of some lumber, this could be a mere couple of sentences at the bottom. But in other cases, the schedule could be really extensive, such as this contract for 3 column capitals at Girard College that Walter designed, that had 3 pages describing the exact ornamentation and scale and proportion of the capitals. So the modern theory and practice of contract, which developed over the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the US, was born of many different parents. Puritan notions of covenants, Hobbesian and Lockean notions of the social contract, marriage covenants, the classical political economy of Adam Smith, as well as abolitionist struggles for freedom. But most important for our purposes here is the freedom of contract's central place in the formation of market capitalism. As Morton Horwitz argues in The Transformation of American Law, the conversion of contract law into its modern form in the first half of the 19th century has to be understood as a reflection of the development of market capitalism and the congealing of the US around a market society. The modern contract at its heart is an expression, quote, of the ideology of a market economy, Horwitz says. In this, it is an expression of the Enlightenment conception of an independent liberal subject as an economic actor. Viewed as a contract then, the design was a technology of codifying informed consent and reciprocity in the market exchange of building. The contractual design was a piece of the worldview that understood architectural design as itself a mediator of voluntary exchange. So in architectural history, we've long had accounts of how architectural form embodies certain ideas of the Enlightenments. But I'm suggesting that attending to the architectural contract gives us another way to think about how the very identity of the individual and quasi-autonomous architect and the formation of their profession was caught up in the wider developments of visions of Enlightenment subjectivity. So a key aspect of Horwitz's argument is that the formation of the modern contract is an embodiment of liberal market capitalism. And he argues that the contractual form developed in the early 19th century, not just to deal with present tense relations of exchange, but rather importantly to deal with exchanges projected into the future. So the contract in its modern form was formed out of speculation on future prices of goods in a time-delayed global commodity market. So in fact, he points to these kind of shifts in US courts and how they litigate cases of contracts. They move from focusing on equity in disputes to focusing on what they call considered consent. So they focus on the idea that the agreement between two parties was entered into in a considered way. The court was not there to judge whether a deal was really fair or not, for no one could know if a deal was fair if it was made in relationship to yet to have occurred future events or future prices. All the courts were able to judge was how parties consensually entered into this unpredictable relationship. So this orientation of the modern contract towards the future was particularly appealing for architectural design. The design was in its very essence a plan for something yet to be done. And as a contract, it was an agreement about something to be delivered over an extended period of time. So let's think a bit about the structure of the contractual design and how it worked through an idea of future completeness. Okay, so let's think about completeness in A.J. Davis's contracts first. So at the beginning of the specification document that he was using in the 1840s and 50s, he prefaced it this way, quote, "The writing and figuring on all the drawings are to be considered as part and parcel of the specification. And this specification and the drawings are to be considered as reciprocally illustrative of each other. So the drawings and the specs are to be understood as harmonious and filling in each other's incompleteness." But there's another step in this argument that's really striking. It stipulates that drawings that are incomplete are nonetheless, quote, "to be understood as if they had been distinctly and severally shown complete." He describes the incompleteness of drawings as core to the way architects work, leaving them partially complete such that they avoid, quote, "the labors of repetition." So the architect's avoidance of repetition in their representation had to itself be stated as part of the contract. The architect's drawing of a door like this one, for example, could be left incomplete, but the builder's construction could not. So it may seem like a trivial or obvious observation that a builder could not just put one door on, like Davis just drew one, but this distinction harbors within it a particular conception of work. The architect's work was not in the repetitions themselves. These were actually to be avoided if possible. Rather, the architect's work was conceived of as taking place in the kind of realm of ideation. In the case of something like a design competition, the ideation of difference or uniqueness or the best. So there's a lot we could probably say here about this idea of like what kind of work deserves to be repetitive and what doesn't. But to return to the specs, let's look at one of Thomas Eustick Walter's, because he went even further along these lines of codifying completion into incompleteness. In the general conditions of some of his 1840s specifications, Walter describes the importance of workmanlike execution of the design, quote, "whether the same shall have been herein specified or not." In fact, he continued, "the work that may not have been specifically mentioned shall be furnished by the contractor as though it had been particularly specified." So the contractor was to do undescribed work as if it were precisely described. In fact, this was a common line of contractual language. It appears in Davis's standard contracts as well. All carpenter's work was to be perfectly executed, whether the same may or may not be minutely specified. And indeed, in those 1858 Lawrence, Massachusetts courthouse specs that I described earlier, this was stated even more boldly. Quote, "if anything is omitted in this specification or the plan that is necessary to carry out the design of plans, they shall be furnished and made the same as if they were particularly described." So this is my first point about this specific shape of contractual design. Architects framed the contractual design as implicitly complete. That is, what was explicitly unfinished, whether that was deliberate or not, whether the architect purposely did part of the drawing or they forgot to put something in the specifications, this was all to be contractually understood as if it were actually finished. So as already discussed, Horwitz argues that the contract is a legal form developed in particular to deal not with present tense relations, but rather those that projected into the future. Not only was the design a plan for something yet to be done, but also the design itself was a temporal process that moved from the overall plan to specific details. Architects wrote this temporality into their contracts. Take, for instance, the New York architect Richard Upjohn's modification of a contract that he used sometimes that was published by a prolific publisher of legal blanks. And look at how he uses it here for this 1851 church. The builder was to follow the drawings and specifications that Upjohn and Company had made and provided, and those that, as Upjohn inserted by hand, were to be made. So the contract was both for design done and at the same time a design not yet finished. This kind of stipulation was also very common. In Thomas Usick Walter's federal contracts, for example, in the 1850s, it's really common to see the line that says that the contract included, quote, the accompanying plans and such detailed drawings as may from time to time be furnished. So whereas Walter might produce a drawing like the one on the left before the contractual agreement, the details on the right might follow down the road. Again, this might seem like a fairly mundane observation, but what is being codified into the contract is a temporal notion of the design. Architectural scale is not just an issue of spatiality, it's also temporal. So this is my second point. The contract codified a way to understand the design both as something commanding in the present and as something complete in the future. And in fact, the design was itself something not truly complete until the building that it prefigured was itself also complete. So printed standardized specs in the US, as far as I've been able to tell, originated with Walter in the 1830s, and Davis began doing it in the 1840s. Walter used his standard contract on several projects around Philly in the early 1830s. The agreement that he used was written in relationship to each trade, and it was measured by a discrete units of material or labor. So in this standard form of contract, Walter, acting on behalf of the client, contracted with the builders to provide materials on time and in the right amounts and to, quote, faithfully, diligently, and in good and workmanlike manner, perform the work. Walter's responsibility in turn was to distribute the client's payments to the builder by the agreed upon date. And then Walter gives himself two other rights as the mediating architect. The first is substantial, to nullify the contract with no possibility of appeal if the builder's performance was inadequate, and to withhold 10% of the pay as long as necessary to, quote, indemnify and protect himself and the client. So, and as I already mentioned, each contract would have an appended schedule of what was to be delivered. In Davis's 4-page long conditions and agreement, the structure of authority was very similar. And as I already mentioned, that 4-page agreement was accompanied by a kind of 12-page long set of specifications that would break out details of each individual trade. And you can see the blanks, the kind of spaces that are left to fill in the particulars in relationship to that project. So Davis would go on to adapt this agreement and specifications that were originally framed as being for a house to larger buildings. So for example, in this case of the North Carolina State Hospital for the Insane, Davis had to go back on the back side of that front page and continue to list the drawings because it was a much larger project. And as I began with, the standard conditions that Davis set out in these contracts gave him an enormous range of power. So here's a third point. The contractual design was conceived of as a forge of asymmetrical authority, using the architect's control of the purse strings to generate enormous say over construction work. Money was exchanged for following directions, and the architect was positioned as management in relationship to labor. So these are three of the many features of architectural contracts in the early US Republic. They work together to generate architectural authority while maintaining a certain distance from the construction site, both in terms of financial risk and occupational identity. They shaped a kind of architectural position that was powerful and seemingly approached infallibility. So I want to start to move towards a conclusion here. by talking briefly about a couple of other aspects of the contract that I think deserve more thought. First, I want to suggest that thinking about contractual documents can help us build different histories of architecture. The entire block of text at the beginning of Davis's standard contract, which I discussed earlier, was borrowed from an 1824 specification for a church in Regent Square in London, designed by William Tite, which were reprinted in Architectural Precedents, an 1841 book by the British architect Christopher Davy, which Davis owned. And actually, large portions of Davis's standard contract were lifted from specifications published by the prolific English architectural writer John C. Loudon in his encyclopedia. So this is on the lower part, a discussion, a kind of final discussion of Carpenter's work from Davis's standard contract, and it's most of it's copied directly out of this specification from Loudon. And in fact, there's only a couple of drawings that are actually printed in the standard specifications that Davis used. And these drawings and the text around them are also actually lifted from Loudon's encyclopedia. These are drawings and text concerned with archways, and in particular with inverted arches that would redistribute load in the foundation. That Davis included these drawings, and only these drawings in his specs, was perhaps not surprising. American architects in the early 19th century seem to have been particularly vexed by the problem of inverted arches, at least since Latrobe had fought with contractors about which way to look at a set of drawings in Baltimore at the beginning of the century. So this photo on the right is in the foundations of the Baltimore Cathedral that Latrobe designed in the first decade of the 19th century. The drawing on the left is one of several that he sent the drawings to the contractor. He didn't spend enough time, or didn't spend much time on site at all. And the kind of head of the building site at this point was looking at the drawings upside down because he thought they were arches and not inverted arches. So Latrobe was particularly angry about this issue. If you can't figure out which way to look at a drawing, how am I going to communicate? So all of this suggests a kind of different set of paths for the transmission of architectural ideas, and in particular of ideas about architectural practice that architects saw as eminently repeatable. It further suggests a kind of different way of tracing ideas about architectural identity and practice, not through a consideration of form, which these two projects could potentially be related along that account, but rather through the techniques architects use to direct construction of that form. So these two projects, these are the drawings that went along with a set of specs that Davis used, and that parts of which he copied from Loudon for this project that Loudon had printed up. So, and some other narrative of how we think about the transmission of architectural ideas, and in particular, what you can steal or repeat or crib from others, is something that we could consider through contracts. And second, I want to suggest that there's a very important pressure relief valve that was built into contracts around qualitative judgment. So some of the most common language that you see in building contracts in the early 19th century is that of work being well and properly done, as you see here in this Walter specs that we had already seen, and executed and furnished in, quote, a good and workmanlike manner. So these terms of well and properly, good, workmanlike are repeated probably more than any other term in contracts. And in terms of materials and work as well, the term best is also likewise prolific. So another thing that is worth considering kind of at a long, in a sustained way, is the way these kind of baseline and superlative terms of quality shaped architectural authority and the way those interacted with the judgments of labor. What in fact is a best piece of lumber? What is workmanlike execution of masonry or bricklaying work, for example? So to bring this towards a conclusion, let me back out to the big picture again. DeFourier's description of the architectural critic as an angel with dirty hands is useful in describing the vision of the profession and how it created this kind of vision of itself. That is, the identity of the architect was formulated in the early 19th century US and tension around the source and reach of professional authority. The tension was between the image of the architect as a mediator and the architect as this world historical illustrator, an orchestrator of history itself. The contract, formulated as an agreement between the client and builder, or sometimes the architect as a representative of the client and the builder, and in which this contract in which the architect and their design work served as a neutral mediator of market exchange, was useful in trying to stitch together these two identities. The architect used the contract to try to pursue an identity that aimed at being in but not of the market. The contract is something that allowed the architect to function and have their design work in the kind of space of the market, but was written in a way where the architect is indeed the author of that contractual relation. The architect tries themselves to sit outside of this kind of contractual exchange between builder and client. And so what I'd further suggest is that in the case of this contract for the Charles H. Davis house, we see the very limits of the ideational vision of design, one in which the architect was put under erasure in the market exchange that realized design. So this was the ideal vision, design freed from the burden of the kind of financial and material restraints of building. But this is only a kind of ideal that an architect could asymptotically approach. The architect wanted to paradoxically be a mediator without the messiness of mediating. They wanted to be a mediator whose world was above the market at the world historical level, yet one that still directed market exchange. So the places an architect could retreat to try to keep their hands clean were limited, but they could find them, especially if they had enough money. Alexander Jackson Davis, for example, loved his library because it was this kind of grand visionary world of architectural history to which he could retreat. So this is a drawing of his second library in 1840s. The first one burned down in a fire in 1830s. He loved this library so much, so along the kind of top wall, along the top wall of the plan is a series of bookcases, tables below this, but over on the right side of the plan behind another set of bookcases is his bed. He loved his library so much that he wound up sleeping in it for a good part of the 1840s and 50s. I had one more slide that disappeared, but what that amazing final slide is a quote from another architect in Providence, Rhode Island, that wrote to Davis earlier in the 1820s, and this was a builder. So Buckland is the person in Providence, and he was a builder, and he was aspiring to be an architect. And he wrote to Davis, and he said something along the lines of, "You're really lucky to have your library that you can retreat to and spend time inside of. You don't know the burdens and pains of being a contractor who has to deal with labor and the reality of financial limitations." So that kind of vision of the library as a realm of escape for a contractor that was aspiring to be an architect, I think sums up a kind of picture of both a relationship to the material world and an attempt to escape from it. And that's where I'll end. So thanks for the chance to chat. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you. There are some questions from the audience. Maybe Alejandro, since you're sitting here in the front row, you can kick on.
Yeah. I'm actually a little bit curious about, since we read a little bit more about the contracts, how the contracts have changed also our ways of experiencing architecture, like architects being so distant from the side, how this change is also present in today. I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I can hear like 95% of what you're saying. So your question is along the lines of like how this winds up sticking with us today, how we experience
Exactly.
this in the present. Yeah, I mean it's a great question to which I feel like I'll probably get a very inadequate answer. But I mean, in the sense for me is that why this moment is so important is indeed that kind of shape of the contract, the shape of the kind of professional identity of the architect is really being formulated at this moment. And that kind of contractual relationship to things, I'd say in particular, the kind of shift in the attempt to use the contract to define architectural authority in a wider and broader sense only continues over the latter part of the 19th century and obviously into the 20th century. Contract specifications in particular get a lot longer as you see. I mean, there's been a few people that have written about this. There's a article by Katie Lloyd Thomas and Thilo Amhoff that's, and I can't remember the exact name of the book. It's a book that Peggy Deemer edited. But one of the points that they make is that you kind of see a shift in a couple of ways. You see a shift over the 19th and 20th century in specification writing, where things get much more extensive. We move away from this kind of qualitative language towards more and more quantitative language. So there'd be an attempt to remove some of that kind of imprecision that the 19th century was still harboring from even previous kind of 18th century contracts. So in one sense, yeah, we see an attempt to remove imprecision, but the term workman like still is prolific in building contracts now. So the kind of attempt to standardize, yet the kind of limits of standardization, I think is one interesting theme that would be kind of worth thinking about over the 20th century. Another point that would be worth interesting thinking about is the kind of shift from means to ends in the way specifications lay things out in particular. This shift from the specifications in the 19th century that I'm looking at, I think as you probably noticed, each of the categories is not named, it's not named excavation work or bricks or stonework. It's actually named by the task. So the excavators specifications, the specifications for the bricklayer. And in a lot of the kind of early 19th century contractual language that's in the specification, it's descriptions of how the means by which one would carry out work. So Upjohn's specs would say something like, if you're throwing concrete into a ditch, you need to be at least 8 feet away from it so that the concrete gets as dense as it needs to. So there'd be a lot of descriptions about how to do things. And what Thomas and Amhoff kind of described as a shift away from that kind of means-based description more towards an ends, where it's not taking responsibility for the means and methods of construction, but becomes a way of specifying what the final object has to be like. So I think that would be a kind of second category that would be worth thinking about as it shifts. And then maybe a third one would be the kind of shift from the shift that I think you see in these kind of 19th century contracts where they're trying to codify incompleteness into them. And that would be this kind of shift away from architects trying to say everything about the project to saying there's a bunch of assumed and standardized ways of doing stuff. And unless I specify it otherwise, you need to assume that you have to do it this way. And I think in these early 19th century contracts, you see these architects kind of wrestling with this problem of how to describe, you should do everything the way I standardly think work is done. And you should do it that way. And yet they don't have a description of standards yet. There's not suites catalogs, there's not things like that. So they just say, well, just do it as if it was finished. Like, do the work as if I described it, even though maybe I didn't describe it here. So I think that shift towards standardization is kind of being figured here, but this moment, it seems unclear to them exactly how to describe it because the standards aren't in fact yet there. I think those are the three kind of categories that come to mind immediately, but I feel like that's still probably a really inadequate answer here. In the sense that the larger idea would be that we're still wrestling with, I think we still, obviously, as we still are in identity crisis to a certain extent as a field and as a profession, and that tension between the imagination of architecture as this broadly kind of world-changing thing, and the kind of tensions and realities of practicing it as mediating between someone else's money and getting stuff done in the material world. I think that tension still sits with us. It's certainly present in architecture schools. It's certainly something that Tafuri, was at pains to describe in the 1970s, right? That architects sometimes just flee from that kind of messy world. We wind up just creating another messy world inside. But so I'd say, like, in the larger sense, to me, it still feels like this tension is here in the way we teach and think about architecture.
Thank you.
That's a lot of stuff. I hope that all kind of holds together as an answer.
Ines?
Hey, thank you for your lecture. I'm Ines. So in the 1840s, the number of architects were low, and it was a really elitist profession. So an architect had a lot of pressure, and all the responsibility was on him. But right now, we are a lot of architects, and buildings are huge. You were talking about 4-story buildings, but right now we have 400-story buildings. So I will compare architecture with medicine. Do you think, like, in the future, as doctor, are really specialized, and we have like dermatologists and surgeons? Do you think that is probably the future of architecture, that we are really specialized and we have like an architect that only design windows or only design layouts or something like that?
Yeah. It's a great question. And as somebody who spends most of their time thinking about the 19th and early 20th century, it feels unnerving to speculate on where things actually are headed. But it does seem like there was for these architects in the early 19th century, their relationship to the kind of contractual devices and the job site itself was one that was of real importance. That Walter, for example, when he's designing the Girard College in Philadelphia, it's the largest building and most expensive building in the US when it's built in the 1830s to 40s. Like, it's unbelievably expensive. It's incredibly big for the time. And if you go back through his journals, so most of the contracts for work, there's probably 70, 80 contracts at least for that project. And a lot of them, they're still like 1 to 2 pages. And in fact, like that one that I showed for the column capitals is the longest one for it. And because there were, I think, 36 column capitals, and most contractors could only pull off building 3 or 4 of them at a time. He had contracts with 10 different, something like 8 to 10 different manufacturers to do these column capitals. So he was managing lots of different people, trying to get them to replicate the exact same thing. And a really long set of specification documents became the way of managing that kind of relationship. But with many of the other, like, of the kind of 70 or 80 contracts are really short. So the specifications, I think, and the drawings themselves become key tools for trying to get some kind of standard and order to things. But he also, if you look through his diaries in that period, is on the job site every single day. This is basically the only project that he has. It's keeping him from going bankrupt for a while. He eventually does go bankrupt. But it at least forestalls that, and he spends so much time on the job site. So I think the kind of even as these architects are articulating their kind of position as one that's a kind of intellectual space removed from the job site, and the reality for really large construction projects that they tried to maintain some control over, they were on the site constantly. And the contracts and the drawings could have limits because they were communicating in person. Obviously, the kind of shift in that now towards the kind of proliferation of documentation as the means of mediation. And like in your pro practice classes, when you're, or at least in the US and in pro practice class, when they're told, like, if you see something being done wrong, you tell them to stop, and then you leave the site and you start sending emails and new drawings, because you want to create the paper trail for the correction of that. You don't just say, oh, move that 2 feet over, right? The kind of turn towards the kind of proliferation of the mediational techniques of architects in 20th, 21st century, I think certainly shifts that kind of authorly relationship, how authorship of the actual process of mediation is conceived. And I guess what I would kind of wonder, what your question makes me think about is how much does that relate to the kind of ambitions of the kind of overall total design at this point? When the architect, when we start to split into identities, like an architect that really, you know, is the kind of expert in facades, for example, or even more specifically, like how a window intersects with a particular material, like all that kind of splitting of the kind of work of creating all the documentation to do this kind of material transformation of the world. I imagine that there's even a larger gap that kind of grows between the belief and pursuit of a kind of totalizing view of architecture and the particular details of working it out. Whereas for a lot of these early 19th century architects, I think, even though these are two different identities, they can dress really nicely and walk on the construction site and maybe even reconcile some of that by walking from their library to the construction site and back to the library, that those two visions kind of sit a little bit closer. So I don't know if that's a really great answer, but my thought is that the proliferation of literally the kind of documentation that mediates shifts our kind of relationship between these two identities.
Thank you.
Sebastian, final question.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for the interesting lecture. I was interested in this term where you phrased it, that the architect began to have a particular conception of work being ideation, and also the fact that things became more and more predetermined and buildings would have to be more and more specified beforehand and before even starting construction. How would you phrase the architect's role before this state of ideation, whereby they were on site but still designing? That kind of being an active part of the building process, what sort of difference does that have in terms of ideation?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I'm trying to remember the book. It's on the shelf back there somewhere. I think you can see this largely developing in kind of turn of the 19th century building culture, both in England and in the US, where most of these kind of US practitioners are getting ideas about their work. And I think that it really is this kind of belief that the realm of ideation, this kind of, the reason that architects start giving lectures about architecture in the 1830s and 40s is to say, we are people that know the history of architecture. In order to like truly carry out the kind of ideational work of doing architecture, of designing architecture and getting it executed, architecture that truly makes a better moral national society. I mean, they're phrasing much of this in this kind of very large moral and ethical terms, that in order to do that, one has to do lots of study of the history of architecture. And that becomes central to the kind of formation of this identity of the professional architect as someone that's different from a mere builder. But Latrobe in 1800s into 1810s, he would say the profession, or what we would call architecture prior to me showing up in the US and kind of sharing this kind of English idea about architectural practice, was in the hands of two different kinds of people. There were those builders that knew how to do stuff, but had not done the kind of deep historical and theoretical study. Therefore, they could never even though they might execute a building well, they're basically executing by repeating and copying. Says they aren't ideating, they aren't pursuing this deep kind of process of ideation that the architect is capable of because of their intellectual training. So there's those people, but there were also this other group of people, the kind of gentlemen amateurs, people that had traveled. Well, Thomas Jefferson would be a great example in Latrobe's mind. Like people that had traveled, they had seen a lot of architecture, they had enough money to build their own library, they had books, they had means of studying, but they hadn't actually practiced in the sense of engaging with stuff on a construction site on a daily basis So their world was in the clouds, but it was detached from the kind of world of practice. And in a sense, they're repeating the first kind of lines from Vitruvius's 10 books, right? The architect has to be someone that both knows how to practice and knows how to theorize. I mean, I think that attempt to articulate some sort of mediatory position is what gives these architects in the early 19th century the kind of shape of their profession, that here's what the identity that we're pursuing is. But I think the kind of key here is that the way they claim to have authority in the material world is that they mediate between builders and money. And that's the kind of on the ground authority they have, and they're shaping it through market exchange. And so the way they start to create their relationship to the material kind of practice of being on the construction site is through the market itself. So the kind of developing forms of capitalism are what shape the way architects say they have material practice. And so the kind of ideational world now has something else that it relates to. It's not just a medieval builder that's, or a medieval kind of master stonemason. It's, we ideate, we think, we have our libraries, we have our spaces that we do that. And the way we engage with the material world is via the market. So I think it's actually the shift in there. I think there's always been, I'm sure there's, for, we have a very deep history of ideating about architecture, and we could draw links directly from Renaissance ideas about ideating about architecture to the 19th century. But I think the kind of way of the kind of primacy that the contract creates and the kind of market exchange is the way of getting into the material process of construction. I think that's what starts to shift what's going on in the early 19th century. Is that, I think I'm approaching an answer to the question.
Thank you.
One last question, Alonso?
I was thinking in the concept that they use in the contract of the past about quality, like how to make all the things happen. And I was wondering why in the contemporary contracts we lose this idea to add the qualities, because we think that everything is going to be perfect, or why?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's a fantastic question. Like, where does discussion about qualitative accounts of architecture take place? Can we make it take place within market exchange, within the kind of realm of the contract, or is that migrated somewhere else? Like maybe this is a bad example, but I could imagine saying, like, you have people like Stephen Hall or Juhani Pallasmaa, or people that kind of identify themselves with what we could call the phenomenological tradition in architecture, that everything's about qualitative experience in the way they talk about their architecture, right? And the way they present it to other architects. And I guess, and this is something I haven't looked at, but you could ask, like, how does those ambitions migrate into the kind of directions for how to construct and how to build? Like, does any of that kind of, I know they're not going to quote Merleau-Ponty in a contract, but is there a way to understand that, Heidegger shows up in is dwelling in the contract somehow? I mean, that I would love to try to process that, because that gap, I think, between these kind of ambitions of qualitative experience as something that architects deeply control and care about, and then the way we realize the kind of construction of these projects within within global capitalism, seems like a real kind of gap. So like, Hall designs a building, but then when Stephen Hall Architects executes it, what is all the kind of proliferation of mediatory working drawings and contracts look like? It might not be that much different than any other, than SOM or any other large scale practice. So like, that seems like an amazing question to ask, like, how does that kind of abstraction and talk about qualitative work show up or not show up in contracts anymore? But I think like the general historical answer would be, So I sent two readings that I thought might be useful. There's a chapter in Howard Davis's book, The Culture of Building, where he follows this kind of arc. And he basically says that qualitative language evaporates from from contracts as as quantitative language takes over. So we shift from stuff that's not entirely measurable to an attempt to find things that are much more measurable. And I think you could probably relate that to the kind of judgment of architecture through specifications based on the ends that are achieved. To legally dispute something or dispute something through the kind of realm of whether somebody has to pay to take it apart and put it back together again, the quantitative realm seems like the way one would do that. So I think that shift probably has a lot to do with just like an attempt to assert control through market relationships, and assert control in the way we understand kind of legal judgments to take place. But I love the idea of flipping the question and saying, like, how would our pursuits of quality show up in the kind of the daily workings of architecture? I mean, I don't know about y'all. I mean, my experience, of course, was like I did architecture school. I went out and practiced, and I felt deeply resolutely disappointed by my experience in practice, which is why I went back to school. I was like, I'll just be a historian, right? So that return, that is, I see that a lot in these 19th century architects, a certain disappointment, and I wonder if thinking about this question could also be a way of raising the kind of questions of why are we disappointed, what are we expecting, and what would the shape of things look like that pursued things in a way that quality was a primary way of judging them.
Thank you.
Brian, you're the last question.
Hi, Bryan. I live on the edge.
Hi.
For
I was
once.
wondering.
For once.
I was wondering if you could share some of the processes that you had to go through, because I think what you presented today, it's a wonderful example on how to engage with documents, with archival material. It's very much you as an analogy of, the client and architect reading through the contract and, making annotations and reading the small footnotes to find those nuances and subtleties. I couldn't imagine you, with a magnifying glass or, scheduling meetings with that expert who is capable of translating 18th and 19th century handwriting into, actual readable words. Or, as a lawyer that suddenly expands all the pages of a document on a very large table, starts highlighting and comparing and contrasting, because the only way you could have arrived to the idea of, the proliferation of certain words as good or workmanlike is by, compiling examples of these words. So I was wondering if you could just share some of those, processes as a historian engaging with these documents.
Yeah. I mean, 18th and 19th century handwriting is exhausting. Some people have better handwriting than others, and as they age, you can often see it going downhill. On that front, it's like just the more you do it, the more it starts to actually click. Like it's a lot easier to read it than it was 10 years ago for me. But methodologically, yeah, I mean, it's a great question because, I mean, this is one of a very large question for architectural history today, I think, is what are the pieces of evidence that we choose to work with, and what are we skilled and trained in looking at, and what are we not so skilled and trained in looking at. So I mean, my dissertation advisor was Michael Hayes, and he's very good at looking at drawings and talking about theory, but he's not a legal historian, right? And the kind of use of architectural contracts to kind of think through stuff would not be primary. So it's not a thing that I learned how to do, and I'm still not a legal historian. So talking to other legal historians about how they look at these materials has been very helpful. But ultimately, like archivally, most of this stuff is spread out over 7 or 8 different archives in New York and Philadelphia, New Orleans, Charleston, kind of basically from Boston, Massachusetts down to New Orleans, it's spread out. And a lot of the work has been finding as many contracts as I possibly can. I think I probably have about 50 of them now, from probably 20 or 30 different architects. Finding those contracts and starting to make comparisons amongst them. Like most of them are not TypeScript, most of them are handwritten. So it's converting those into Google Docs or something else. And one of my colleagues here has said he eventually can help me do some like machine learning stuff on this, which I don't know how to do at all, but he says he can help me do this, and we can start finding other patterns that I might not be seeing in the documents. But a lot of it is like just getting as many of these as possible and reading them over and over and starting to find links between them or similarities between them. The other thing that you know is I think the piece of the puzzle that's not always so easy. It's useful with an architect like AJ Davis, who kept up with his whole life, is to try to start coordinating what architects were doing on a daily basis with the kind of work, with specification writing, with doing drawings, with being on site, like using their diaries in relationship to the drawings, in relationship to the written documents that they're producing, and trying to triangulate between all of that stuff, I think is a large part of the process here. And it's a process that I would say, like, it would be nice if you could like streamline it into something, but for me, it's been just a kind of messy, like I've got to go through this stuff over and over. And then at some point I see something in Walter's contract that I'm like, oh yeah, I think I remember seeing a word like that or a phrase like that and something that came from New Orleans in the 1830s. And then I'll find that comparison. So I think a lot of it's like getting a bunch of stuff and then trying to just look at it long enough that the relationships emerge. But I'm sure there are better techniques. I mean, the addition of things like Google Books now that have done a really good job of scanning lots of 19th century texts is really helpful, because I can start dropping phrases in there to see if they pop up. So that's how if it's easier to find something in Loudon's encyclopedia, which is like 1,000 pages, by dropping a phrase in Google Books and it popping up. So yeah, it's messy, and it is mostly a process of just grabbing lots of stuff from the archives and looking at it for a very long time. That's like the boring version of the historian's answer, right? You just have to look at it forever, and then things start to emerge.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Bryan. Thank you for the great talk. And have a great rest of your morning.
Yes, thank you. The sun is coming up now.
The sun is rising.
Yeah.
It's setting here.
Yeah.
And it's rising there. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the time.